This instructional video is designed to assist you in the assembly of Case IH Concord Narrow Transport Air Till Drill. For more detailed guidelines and explanations, refer to the assembly manual. Since the purpose of this video is supplemental, we recommend that you view it in its entirety before you start to assemble the drill. Now, let's get started. To begin, place the main frame and wing sections on stands at least 28 inches high. This will allow you enough clearance to mount the shanks without the openers. Attach the frame sections at the hinge points with 1 1/4 by 5 inch hinge pins and flat washers. 2 flat washers should be used as spacers on each side of the single fork. Secure each pin with a flat washer and cotter pin. On drills that are 27 to 30 feet in width, bolt-on wing extensions are necessary. The wing extensions are fastened to the wing frames with a 1/2 inch by 1 1/2 inch carriage bolts, flat washers, and nuts. Make sure that you line up the wing and the extension frames so they are level. When you tighten the extension frame, start at the middle and work towards the outside. The cylinder anchor mount comes pre-assembled from the factory. Verify the adjustment rod positioning is 1 1/2 inches from the centers of both the anchor mount bolt and the cylinder rod mount. Now mount the cylinder anchor assembly to the frame using 1 inch by 5 inch bolts and nylock nuts. Install the wing lift attachment on the wing frame. Fasten it with 4 3/4 inch by 6 inch bolts, 2 bolting plates underneath the wing, and 4 nylock nuts. Tighten all bolts. Mount the wing stop tower on the main frame using 3/4 inch by 3 inch bolts, flat washers, and nylock nuts. Do not tighten them at this time. The bolts must be secured after the drill is winged up and the stop tower has been adjusted, so that each wing will rest on the stops. Mount the caster towers to the frames with 3 1 inch by 5 inch bolts and nylock nuts. Tighten all tower bolts at this time. Install the grease zerks at this time. The grease zerks on the bottom arm must be a 90-degree elbow style zerk and should be installed with the zerks facing each other. Attach the bottom parallel arm and top parallel arm to the caster tower mount on the drill frame by using the 1 inch pivot pins, flat washers, and cotter pins. Install bushing tube to lug hole on bottom parallel arm. Attach front link over bushing and install 1 inch modified bolt. Apply Loctite to bolt and tighten with 1 inch jam nut. The adjustment yoke will not be able to be attached until the rock shafts have been installed. To assemble the caster linkage, first put anti-seize compound on the threads of the adjustment yoke and front link. Thread the jam nuts onto the adjustment yoke and front link. Now thread the adjustment yoke and front link to each end of the turnbuckle, making sure both ends are threaded equally onto the turnbuckle. This can be checked by measuring the remaining thread length on both sections. To roughly set the entire parallel linkage arm, measure from the center of the yoke pin to the center of the link pin. On 4 rank drills, use 107 5/8 inches. On 3 rank drills, the distance is 77 5/8 inches. Once set, secure the jam nuts on both ends of the turnbuckle. To mount the single tire front casters, it is important to note that they must be mounted with the spindles pointing towards the outside of the drill. Mount the front casters to the parallel arms using the 1 inch pivot pins, flat washers, and cotter pins. You may find the mounting of tires easier after the caster assembly is mounted to the caster towers. Measure out and mark shank locations according to the diagrams for the desired pattern as shown in the assembly manual. All the measurements are from the center line of the machine to the center line of the shanks. If you are installing Coulters on 4 rank drill, the shanks must be mounted using the standard or herringbone patterns on the last 3 ranks of the drill. The first rank must remain open for clearance between the Coulters and caster wheels. Refer to the Coulter assembly section of the manual for further instructions. There are 3 basic shank patterns to choose from for the narrow transport drill. The customer needs to be aware of the different patterns and their characteristics in order to determine which shank pattern works best for their conditions. The standard pattern. This pattern allows for maximum trash clearance. However, in hilly conditions, it can cause the drill to drift more on hillsides. The herringbone pattern. This pattern eliminates any tendencies to drift, but has one location where the shanks are closer together. This occurs in the area where the pattern changes and will be more susceptible to plugging in heavy residue conditions. The universal pattern. This pattern is used on 4-rank drills only when shanks are mounted on each of the ranks. This pattern provides superior trash clearance and does not influence the drill to drift in either direction. To install trip shank assemblies, place the mounting bracket over the frame and attach to the shanks with the 5/8 by 1 inch bolts and lock washers. Evenly tighten the bolts so the shank draws up uniformly against the bottom of the frame. The shank and mounting bracket do not tighten against each other, and a gap between the two pieces should be consistent between the front and rear side of the mount. Spacer plates are provided to lower the shanks following the tractor's wheel tracks. As general rule for placement, skip the 4 center shanks on the drill while placing 6 plates on each side. 12 or more spacer plates will be needed to adequately cover all the tracks. More than one spacer plate can be used to provide additional depth for each shank. However, longer bolts will be needed in order to be properly tightened. If only one spacer plate is used, which lowers the shanks 3/8 of an inch, a 5/8 by 2 inch bolt is needed. By stacking 2 spacer plates together, the shank will be lowered 3/4 of an inch. This will require a 5/8 by 2.5 inch bolt. Failure to use correct bolt length can result in damage to the shank assembly and will void its warranty. To install the solid mount shank assembly, place one of the 2 5/8 inch by 4.5 inch by 7 inch mounting plates on top of the drill frame. Place 2 3/4 inch by 8 inch grade 5 bolts in the back 2 holes of the plate. Place a 5/8 inch by 8 inch grade 8 bolt into the front hole of the mounting plate. Slide the second mounting plate along with a 5/8 inch by 4.5 inch by 2 inch strapping plate onto the bolts on the bottom side. Install 3/4 inch lock washers and nuts onto the back 2 bolts of the plates. To install shank, slide it between the lower mounting plate and the strapping plate and push forward until the front bolt can be placed through the shank hole. Install the 5/8 inch lock washer and nut and firmly tighten all 3 bolts. Standard spring cushion shanks are shipped without the shanks installed in the mounts. Install the mounts with the springs on the front side of the ranks with mounting plate and 5/8 inch by 6.5 inch bolts, lock washers, and nuts. Spacer plates are provided to lower the shanks behind the tractor tracks. The plates can be used to lower the shanks either 3/8 of an inch with 1 plate or 3/4 of an inch with 2 plates. 1 plate is more common, but if 2 plates are used, it is necessary to replace the shank bolts with 5/8 inch by 7 inch bolts. Tighten bolts evenly and make sure that the bolt heads recess into bottom casting. Slide shank into the housing so that the pin on the flipper engages the hole in the shank. Insert U-bolt from bottom of holder so it captures recess in flipper. Place springs over U-bolt and rotate so that they are seated in the bottom housing. Install top casting so that springs are seated on the top. Install nuts and tighten so that 11 to 13 threads appear above the nuts. It is important to know that Coulter assemblies can only be used on 4-rank drills. When installing Coulters, shanks must be mounted using the standard or herringbone patterns on the last 3 ranks of the drill. The first rank must remain open for clearance between the Coulters and caster wheels. First, insert the washer onto the Coulter shank and then insert it into the spring-loaded Coulter arm. Make sure the Coulter shank is pivoted towards the hub. Insert the larger roll pin until it is flush with the hole at the other end. Now insert the smaller roll pin.
Okay, that's it.
Install the blade onto the hub and then tighten the lugs. For mounting the Coulter assembly to your particular shank, please refer to the assembly manual for detailed instructions. Selection of leveling devices is based upon your machine's configuration. On 3 rank drills, the disc levelers is the only option that will work within the space available. On 4 rank drills, select from disc levelers or a 3-bar harrow. The disc leveler functions as a rolling shield to prevent a condition called stepping. Stepping is when the front shank gets covered by the second and third row of shanks, creating uneven seed cover. First, mount the discs to the spring-loaded arm and leave the bolts loose. To mount the disc levelers to shank, use 2 1/2-inch U-bolts and center lock nuts. The proper starting point for the leveler is to have the bottom of the disc blade 1 to 1.5 inches above the bottom of most openers. Refer to the assembly manual for disc leveler layouts for different size drills, shank patterns, and opener types. Remember that these are only suggested starting points. Final adjustment will need to be done in the field. Lay out the rock shaft and wheel gang assemblies at the rear of the machine according to the layout diagram in the manual. Slide the rock shaft bearing arms on the main frame and wing assemblies and attach using 3/4 inch by 6 inch grade 6 bolts and nylock nuts. All bolts are positioned from the top down, except for mounting the middle arms on the main frame under the rear hitch area. Those bolts are placed from the bottom up. Install the wheel gang assemblies to the rock shafts using 1 1/4 inch by 23 5/8 inch pivot pins. Use a chain or sling to hold the rock shaft high enough to install the pins. The pins are secured by 3/8 inch by 2.5 inch bolts and nylock nuts. Notice that the pins are installed from the front on some frames and from the rear on others. Look for the position of the collar on the rock shaft that holds the lock bolt to determine the direction of the pin. In preparation for installing the walk beams, spread anti-seize compound to the non-threaded portion of the 1 inch by 4.5 inch bolts. Place a plastic pad on each side of the walk beam and secure to the wheel gang assemblies with the 1 inch anti-seized bolts. Install the bolt from the right side of the wheel gang assembly, with the bolt head being captured in the retainer lock on the gang assembly. Place 2 flat washers and 2 jam nuts onto the bolt. Install the walk beams with the right hand spindle forward. Tighten nuts enough to capture walk beams securely, but not so tight that they cannot be pivoted by hand with some force. Special wrenches are provided with the drill for the walk beam nuts. On 10-inch spacing drills, a special technique is required to get the tires into place. Run the left tire into where the rim lip is centered to the hubcap, but at a location where you can still get the face of the right tire into the hub area of the left tire. Push the left tire forward as you rotate the right tire around the hub. Keep both tires vertical. Mount the tires to the hubs with 1/2 inch lug bolts. It is necessary to have adjacent tires in place before tightening. Tighten the lug bolts to 65 foot-pounds. After you have tightened the Packard tires and are ready to lower the wheel gang assemblies, attach the adjustment yoke of the depth control linkage to the rock shaft using the 1 inch pivot pins as the wheel gang is lowered. Install all hydraulic cylinders and hoses according to the schematic in the assembly manual. All depth control cylinders are mounted with the rod ends to the top. Mount all cylinders with ports at the top. Install the 4x8 hydraulic cylinders on the main frame. Attach cylinder base to the cylinder anchor on the frame of the drill. Fasten the rod end clevis to the rock shaft assembly. Install 3 3/4 inch by 8 inch hydraulic cylinders on the wing frame. Route hydraulic hoses from the cylinders through the adjustment yoke of the linkage. All cylinders will have elbow hydraulic fittings installed with the elbow facing towards the base of the cylinder. Do not tighten the fittings until all the hoses have been routed to the depth control cylinders. With a 3/8 inch by 1 inch bolt, washer, and clamp, attach all hydraulic hoses to the tie-down locations. Larger clamps and backing plates are supplied for locations where more than 2 hoses onto a frame member less than 4 inches wide. Refer to the hydraulic schematic within the assembly manual for correct installation and hose placement. Next, let's install the 4-inch by 30-inch wing lift cylinders. Lift the cylinder in place with the base end pointing inward and the rod end extending out towards the wing. Insert the base end pin and wing section pin, slide washers on both sides, and insert cotter pins. Install the hydraulic elbow fittings into the ports of the cylinders. Restrictor fittings are installed on the elbow fittings located on the rod end of the cylinder. On drills equipped with Coulters, it may be necessary to install 5-inch by 30-inch wing cylinders to accommodate the additional weight. To install front drop hole to the main frame, use the 1 1/4 inch by 5-inch pin, flat washer, and cotter pin. Fasten safety chain to drop hole with 1 inch by 8-inch grade 8 bolt, 1 inch heavy-duty washer, spacer, and 1 inch nylock nut. Assemble the perfect hitch assembly to the front of the drop hole using 2 1-inch by 7-inch grade 8 bolts and 1 inch nylock nut. Attach hydraulic hose clamps with 3/8 inch by 1 inch bolt, lock, and flat washers. Mount rear hitch to main frame mounts using 8 3/4 inch by 2.5 inch bolts and nylock nuts. Attach bottom brace to rear hitch and main frame. 2 1/2 inch by 6 inch bolts and nuts, bolting plate, and blank tube are used mounting brace to main frame. 2 1/2 inch by 6 inch bolts and nuts are used to mount brace to the hitch. If the drill is to be equipped with single airstream for tow behind air system, a sliding manifold rail and stand are required. The manifold rail and brace are fastened together with the same bolts. One of the bolting plates from the manifold rail is used on the bottom side of the front cross brace. If drill is equipped with dual airstream, rail and stand are not mounted at this time. On drills with pull-behind air systems with hydraulic blowers, an optional hydraulic line kit is available to supply oil from the tractor to the air system. Assemble the steel lines on the floor. Install 3/8 inch by 2 inch bolt in the single hole of the L bracket, a flat backing plate with the long end down, a rubber strip, the steel lines with the bolt between the 2 large lines, a rubber strip, clamp, flat washer, and nut. After assembling the lines together, they can be installed onto the rear hitch as a single unit. The steel lines for the rear hitch may be installed on either side of the hitch. Mount the rear hitch steel lines using 3 L brackets, bolting plates, and 3/8 inch by 5 inch bolts on the rear hitch. On the front hitch, use the stud bolts and install them to the anchors on the hitch. On each stud, place the following: the hoses with their hold-down clamp, a backing plate for the line kit with the long portion to the inside of the hitch, a rubber strip, the steel lines with the smallest line to the inside and the stud between the 2 large lines, another rubber strip, flat washers, and nut. Attach the steel line sections together using the 3-foot hoses. The hydraulic tips are not provided with the machine. 4 male tips will be needed for the large 1/2 inch lines. On the small 3/8 inch return line, install a female coupler. Install a hose on the tractor with a male tip to carry the oil from the small line to the tractor reservoir. This 3/8 inch line is for case drain oil from the hydraulic motor, and it is imperative that it drains to the reservoir with no back pressure. Next, install the hydraulic adapter and couplers on the rear hitch. These couplers are supplied with the air systems. Install manifold heads to the bodies, making sure that the body is firmly seated onto the shoulder in the head. Secure by tightening set bolts finger tight. Then tighten the set bolt one turn more and lock in place with the jam nuts. Attach the manifold to the stands using muffler clamps and nuts. Mount each secondary manifold support on the third rank of both 3 and 4 rank drills, and as near to the center of the openers it will supply as possible. Attach with U-bolts and nylock nuts. Position the manifolds so the manifold inlets point to the center of the drill and so that the inlets are about 1 inch above the drill frame. When installing a dual airstream, mount supports as near to each other as possible, but at least 20 inches apart so that hoses will not interfere with each other. Cut the 1-inch hose to length and install between the manifold and ground opener. The 1-inch hoses should have a positive slope from the manifold to the boots. Avoid sags in these hoses. Secure hoses at the manifold with hose clamps and at the ground opener with a screw or clamp, depending on the opener used. Install primary manifold to 5-inch primary tube and make sure the tube is firmly seated into the manifold head. Secure by finger tightening set bolt and then one more turn. Lock set bolt in place with jam nut. When installing a manifold with an even number of ports, position the manifold so the primary tube inlet is centered between 2 of the manifold ports. On drills with pull-behind air systems, a sliding assembly is mounted to the rail on the rear hitch. Refer to the assembly manual for proper mounting instructions for the slide assembly. Once assembled, check to see that the slide will roll freely. Next, install the manifold tube to the mounts using 3/8-inch U-bolts and lock nuts. On pull-behind systems, with the manifold slid to the rear of the drill as far as possible, install a length of 2.5-inch hose between a secondary manifold on the outside of the drill to the nearest port on the primary manifold. Measure the hose and cut the remaining 2.5-inch hoses to the same length. Install the hoses and secure with hose clamps. For distribution accuracy, all of the 2.5-inch hoses must be the same length. As the hoses feeding the inside manifolds will be too long, routing the hoses for the main frame to the opposite back port of the manifold will use up the extra length. Install the 5-inch hose between the air system and drill and secure with clamps. On toe between systems, the hose should be 12.5 feet long. For installation of dual manifolds on pull-behind tanks, see the assembly manual for positioning of slides, hose lengths, and placement of hold-down hardware for the 5-inch hoses. Mount the red tail light assembly to the bracket. Install the slow-moving vehicle to the mounting bracket with the 2 bolts and nut found taped behind the SMV sign. Mount the bracket on the left outer portion of the mainframe toolbar using 3/8 by 4-inch by 5-inch U-bolt and nylock nuts. Mount the safety lights to the upper parallel arm of the mainframe casters using the light bracket, bolting plate, and 2 3/8-inch by 3-inch bolts. Attach amber warning lights to bracket. Light brackets are left and right-handed and must be mounted so that the safety lights are in the vertical position when the drill is in the transport position. Route the safety lamp harness to the 2 warning lamps and tail light. Notice the 3 leads from the safety harness are labeled RS, right side, LS, left side, and TL, tail light. Carefully tie down the wiring harness to the drill with the provided nylon tie straps. Install the pigtail holder for the hydraulic hoses on the front of the drill hitch. Now attach the decals. The Concord logo decals go on the outside of the wings. The wing lock pin warning decals go on the wing lock tower next to the lock pin hole. These 3 warning decals are centered on the 4 by 4-inch tube where the wing lift cylinders attach to the main frame. Put the wing lift restrictor decals on the wing lift cylinders right below the restrictors. Finally, touch up the painted areas that got scratched during the assembly with the touch-up paint provided. This now completes the assembling process of the Case IH Concord Narrow Transport Air-Till Drill. Please remember that this is only a supplement and not a replacement for the assembly manual. You'll need to refer to the assembly manual for more detailed instructions and directions to assemble the drill.